we will conclude with talking about three other nations and their involvement in overseas expansion after Portugal and Spain. Talk about the Netherlands, England, and France. It's kind of confusing, I think, to some kids. Dutch people come from the Netherlands. All right. The city of Amsterdam is in the Netherlands. Holland is sometimes a word people use for the Netherlands, but Holland is actually like a region of the Netherlands. It's just the most important region, and Amsterdam is in Holland. So you might use Holland and the Netherlands interchangeably, but the Netherlands is actually the name of the nation there. Amsterdam is the main city in this era. Yes?
I think we usually mistake, we're usually mistaken with Netherlands and Holland because most of the attractions from the Netherlands actually come from
Is in Holland. Very good. And then to make it even more confusing, if you've ever traveled east in the United States and gone across Pennsylvania, you might have gone through Pennsylvania Dutch country, and you might have thought that the Pennsylvania Dutch must be people from the Netherlands, but that's actually a misunderstanding of the word Deutsch. So the Pennsylvania Dutch are actually German. Anyhow, we'll talk about the Netherlands first. Netherlands is a relatively small kingdom in northern Europe. Much of the wealth from the cities of the Netherlands comes from being connected to that earlier Hanseatic League. You guys remember that? They're going to develop what's called a joint stock company, and we'll talk more about joint stock companies at a later date. But they'll develop a government-chartered company called the Dutch East India Company. But this isn't like your General Motors or your Ford of today. It's a company, and it's a trading company, but they will actually have a military arm. So it's as if General Motors was not too keen on what Ford was doing. General Motors would be able to drive tanks over to Dearborn, Michigan, and start unleashing a volley of fire upon them. So older companies worked a little bit different. So the Dutch East India Company was a chartered company by the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and they would ultimately take control of trade routes in what are known as the Spice Islands, or today called Indonesia.
They take what? They're from
Spice Islands, or Indonesia. What is today Indonesia becomes controlled by the Netherlands. Also, they would charter an explorer, a guy named Henry Hudson, you guys might have heard of. Henry Hudson's going to make his way sailing for the Dutch up the Hudson River. I believe he's British, but he's actually sailing for the Dutch on this expedition. He's going to sail up the Hudson River and stake claim of New York, for example, for the Dutch. And that's why New York, before it was New York, it was New Amsterdam.
It also has the Hudson River.
Huh?
Hudson River.
Yes, that's Hudson River. Henry Hudson, along with other European explorers, as they're making their way through the northern part of North America, are trying to do the exact same thing that Christopher Columbus did, or attempted to do, that Ferdinand Magellan ultimately did, finding a way to get to the east without maybe having to go all the way around the southern tip of South America. So there was a hope that there would be what was called a Northwest Passage, that there was some way to get through North America to the East Indies without having to go all the way around the south. So the Northwest Passage is something that Henry Hudson would be looking for. England as well, France as well, they're doing the same. Let's talk for a moment about England. During the reign of Queen Elizabeth, she was Henry VIII's daughter. During the reign of Queen Elizabeth, in 1578, she will sponsor an expedition by Sir Francis Drake, who will be the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe. So in 1578, and this is, mind you, quite a while, this is 50 years after the Spanish did it, Sir Francis Drake for England will circumnavigate the globe. But I think it's important to mention this because 1578 is just 10 years before 1588 when the British defeat the Spanish Armada. So it's kind of that sign that we're having a shifting in the balance of power in overseas expeditions. By the early 1600s, England is expanding across the Atlantic. By the early 1600s, England is expanding across the Atlantic. Where am I going? And they're creating a overseas colony in North America. You guys heard all about this last year in APUS. You remember the founding of Jamestown in Virginia and then expanding from there. So England will start establishing permanent colonies in North America by 1600. France is also a player, but they're going to be a more minor player in this overseas exploration and expansion. Just like the Dutch, they're searching for a way to get to a Northwest Passage. The French did most of their exploration on what's known as the St. Lawrence Seaway, making their way through the St. Lawrence River, ultimately into the Great Lakes. And that's why our home was once French. Detroit was a French city. The French would also establish trading ports in India. Under King Louis XIV, who is probably certainly the longest reigning and most influential French king, under Louis XIV in the 1600s and into the early 1700s, France would move to increase its overseas holdings, but ultimately defeat in major wars, especially against their rival England, would lead to the decline of overseas power of France. In 1756 to 1763, France and England would wage a war, which some historians want to call it the First World War. It's called the 7 Years' War. The American version of that 7 Years' War was called the French and Indian War. You guys remember this from last year? And in that war, France and England battled each other not only in Europe, but also in the Americas and also in India. And that is why after 1763, when that war ends, you can see France's North American kingdom is North American holdings quite large. After that war, France is going to lose almost all of it. France is going to lose almost all of it. They lose much of North America, right? They're still going to have holdings in Louisiana. They're going to lose much of their holdings in India to the British. So at the end of all of this story, we've got a lot of European exploration, we've got a lot of European expansion, we've got some high points of Spain, and we've got some France doing some things, and we've got the Netherlands doing some things, we've got Portugal doing some things, but in the end, we're going to see a predominance of England, all right? And that takes us all the way from 1450 to the end of this period in 1750.